doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
I'm now going to turn the floor over to Rick Walters to talk about the framework and how it can be used by asset owners. Over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Hubert. We go on to the next slide. We've just done the agenda there. So, yeah, it's great to be here and great to have been involved in this really important project. The purpose of today's session, just to get that clear for everyone, is to receive your comments and feedback. We've already had some, of course, and to really make sure that the feedback we're getting will help us to improve the framework. So let's have that as the focus for the session today. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit about this framework. It's always hard to define a framework because it's a little bit of a nebulous thing, but what this framework is it identifies the SDGs that are relevant to infrastructure assets. So that's what it's trying to do. It does identify those infrastructure asset impacts that are relevant to the SDGs, if you want to look at it the other way around. And it goes further and defines what we're calling here cases and associated conditions for which an SDG contribution statement can be made. So in other words, it's going further than just saying, oh, this SDG is relevant to infrastructure. It's going into what are the particular cases, what are the associated sets of conditions for which you can then make a particular SDG contribution statement. And we'll explore that as we go through. It is also a first step in facilitating better reporting against the SDGs for infrastructure assets and projects. So this framework can be used with other inputs around ESG data, for example, to then allow better reporting against the SDGs, and we'll talk about why that's a useful thing. So I guess the other thing about what it is, it can then become a tool, it can become a useful input for institutional investors and their trustees to meet their fiduciary duties. So as we know, institutional investors and their trustees are required to manage trusts in the interest of participants and their beneficiaries. And I guess the traditional portfolio management kind of theory has made way over recent times for more of a universal ownership approach, under which investors are viewed as holding a slice in the whole global economy and capital markets through their portfolios. They can then improve their long-term financial performance by acting in such a way as to encourage healthy and stable economies and markets. So this is where the SDGs become important, because it's about a bigger picture than just the short-term financial impacts. Now, while ESG data can be reported and used in various forms, the reason that this framework becomes important and useful on top of or with ESG data is that it's presenting that data, that information, in terms of SDG contributions. And the advantage there over perhaps more dull, standardized ESG data is that that is in a form that can be readily understood, because the SDGs themselves are simple, clear, and we must say universally accepted. You know, the SDGs back in 2015 were signed off by 193 countries around the world. So they were accepted as the playbook for what we need to do in this world by 2030 as in terms of targets. And they were put in very human terms. So that's why I guess investors are interested in this. It presents that sort of dry, cold ESG data and transforms it into something, translates it into something that is much more useful in terms of telling the story and explaining to stakeholders about SDG contributions. Next slide. So a little bit more about how this can be used then, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Aurelian to explain a little bit more into the detail. So it's quite flexible in many ways, and the use cases haven't all been defined, but we've identified a sort of a generic use case or methodology, which Aurelian will run you through shortly. But I wanted to just talk more generally about usage. There are many investment strategies available that institutional investors and others use to take account of ESG factors. And many of you will be familiar with things like the responsible investment spectrum, you know, everything from sort of screening right through to ESG integration and everything in between. We think that this kind of tool can be very useful for those kind of decisions and decision making, because it gives that sort of story. It tells that story about those impacts. So it goes beyond just, again, that cold, hard data. So I'll give you some examples. The positive contribution statements that are identified through this framework can be useful in things like best-in-class screening and sustainability-themed investing, because it's highlighting positive impacts. The negative contribution statements might be most useful in things like negative and norms-based screening, where you're trying to avoid something. All of the statements can be useful for ESG integration and corporate engagement. So there's some ways that it can help in terms of responsible investment decision making. Specifically in relation to due diligence, again, the positive contribution statements can tell you about the benefits or potential benefits of projects. The negative ones tell you about risks and describe those in terms of impacts to stakeholders. So that's very useful in terms of understanding and unpacking those risks. The opportunity statements provide information about potential project opportunities that you can then look to leverage in the purchase and beyond the purchase process for an asset. In relation to stewardship of existing assets, the positive contribution statements provide an opportunity to recognise benefits that have been achieved and provide that recognition back to companies. The negative ones, contribution statements, tell you about risks and describe those in terms of potential impacts to stakeholders. Are those risks being managed? Can they be eliminated? They're questions that can be asked in engagement. And the opportunity statements talk about, obviously potential opportunities that can be pursued. So is progress being made in terms of turning those potentials into real positive contributions, not just leaving them on the table? And lastly, in regard to training, this can be a tool to better understand infrastructure as an investment asset class and to quickly identify potential positive and negative contributions that are particular to particular sectors. And then largely in terms of reporting, it can be an input to annual reporting. So rather than, again, having that sort of cold, hard ESG data, it starts to give a story which can be useful in sustainability reports, on websites, and in stakeholder engagement processes. So I'm hoping that gives a little bit of a picture about what it is and the usage case. But I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Aurelian Reynolds, who can dive a little bit deeper into the framework and both how we developed it and also how it actually works. Aurelian?
So I'll just move on to the next slide. So really, now I'm going to talk to you a bit more about the methodology underlying the ESG Sdg framework. So really, the methodology abides by a simple 6-step process. The first is to identify the SDGs that are potentially relevant to the asset of the project. The second is to obtain the necessary ESG data to compare against the relevant conditions. Following with number 3, if all conditions are satisfied for the case, then you can record the relevant contribution statement. Once you've done this and applied this for each SDG target, you can copy all relevant contribution statements to an Sdg Contribution Report, here shown through number 4. After that, within number 5, you can add any important assumptions and details about the source data, and then you can use, finally, the report to communicate with stakeholders and as an input to decision making. And just to provide a bit of background as well to the methodology behind this. So how did this framework come about? So really, this framework came about first by mapping the SDG to the GRESB infrastructure asset assessment. Then we've also attended several workshops led by the UNPRI, notably on infrastructure and the SDGs. And we've also attended the ISA's SDG Reporting 36 session. So ISA is the International Sustainability Accounting and Reporting Standards. We've also had, of course, a review of the GIN IRIS and of the SDG Action Manager from UN Global Compact and VLab. And we've also collaborated with IMP over the last few months, notably about the different dimensions of impact, the 5 dimensions of impact, which I will go into in a bit. So as you can see, we have another flowchart, this time explaining a little more about the dimensions of impact from the IMP and how these are used in order to generate a contribution statement. So first we take and identify an SDG target, but then we look at the what dimension. The what dimension enables us to identify the necessary characteristics and conditions to provide a contribution. So the conditions for the award include the time scope, and the time scope can include, for instance, the reporting year where the data will be needed, or a historical need for data, for instance, year on year. Materiality, which could be based, for instance, on locational characteristics, such as whether the infrastructure asset is located in the vicinity of a natural habitat, or whether it discharges water into the natural environment. We also take into account and in consideration the sector, as well as the life cycle stage, for instance, whether the asset is in operation or in development. The who dimension typically identifies the stakeholder groups that are affected or concerned by the specific target and to which the contribution also affects. So the stakeholders could be the planet, it could be the company employees, it could be the local community. Then we look into the how much dimension, which also uses some of the conditions necessary to contribute to a statement. So the conditions really use the ESG data. And ESG data can be really interpreted in two ways. It could be either qualitative or quantitative. So by qualitative, what we mean is, for instance, that it could be interpreted through a policy, it could be a risk assessment, it could be monitoring. When we talk about quantitative ESG data types, it could be any sort of units or metrics. So for instance, megawatt hours, megaliters, and so forth. Finally, once the conditions of the what and the how much have been fulfilled, we obtain what we call a contribution statement. And the contribution statement can have three different types. It can either make a contribution to an SDG target, it can either have the opportunity to make a contribution, or it can make a negative contribution in relation to the SDG target. So here I'm just picking an example in order to present to you a bit how this SDG framework works. So let's take the example, for instance, of an onshore wind farm, which finds itself in the renewable energy generation sector. Its life cycle is in operation and it is located in a developing country in proximity of a natural habitat. It is also characterized by the fact that it has employees, and another factor is that it has low water consumption. By its sector, we can see that renewable energy generation is likely to be highly material in relation to SDG 7, which is about affordable and clean energy. We also know that, for instance, SDG 4 and SDG 14 are less likely to be relevant to an onshore wind farm simply because SDG 4 is about quality of education and SDG 14 is about life below water. Another characteristic that is likely to influence the SDGs is the fact that the entity has employees. The fact that it has employees means that SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 10, reduced inequalities, are also likely to be material for the entity. Finally, one last characteristic, for instance, is that the asset has low or no water consumption, which means that SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, is unlikely to be material for it as well. I will now stop PowerPoint and present to you in further detail how to use the Excel framework that was shared with everyone in order to demonstrate to you how to use this framework in a more hands-on basis. So continuing with the example of a renewable onshore energy asset, if we pick the spreadsheet, let's start with SDG 7 energy. Now we will now look at SDG 7.1, which is on column C of the tab, and the target SDG 7.1 is to, by 2030, ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. Now, one of the conditions in order to contribute to this target is to be a renewable power or power generation asset, which the onshore wind power farm fulfills. So, based on this characteristic, we can also say that the asset in condition 4 is in operation. So, once these conditions are fulfilled, the time scope, that is the reporting year, the fact that the sector is relevant to the target, that the life cycle stage is also relevant to the target. We also need the data type, which is here represented in column M, and we need to know the electricity generated in megawatt hours by the asset entity. And so once all these conditions have been fulfilled, condition 1 to 5, we can thereby generate what we call a contribution statement. And the contribution here is that by generating X megawatt hours of electricity, the onshore wind power farm contributes to target 7.1. Let's take the other example from another characteristic of the asset, which is the asset has employees. Now, if we look at target 10.2, by 2030, empower and promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status. Once again, we have a look at the different set of conditions that are available to us. Now, we know that the onshore wind farm has employees, which is a condition necessary in order to contribute to this target. We know that the asset indeed is also in operation and development, and the asset has employees, which is also one of the material issues. Now, with these conditions fulfilled, we also see that the necessary data type in order to contribute to this target is to have a policy. Now, let's assume in this specific case that the onshore wind farm does not have a policy in place. This means by not having a policy on inclusion and diversity, the onshore wind farm has an opportunity to make a contribution by having policies on inclusion and diversity. Now, let's pick a final example in relation to the onshore wind farm. Let's pick Sdg 15, Life on Land, specific reference to target 15.1. Now, by 2020, ensure the conservation, restoration, sustainable use of terrestrial and inland freshwater ecosystems, and the services, in particular forests, wetlands, mountains, and drylands in line with obligations under international agreements. Once again, we have a look at condition 3 and the sector. We see that all sectors can make a contribution to this SDG target. Based on this sector, we know that the asset is also eligible for this target. And we'll now look at the condition number 2 in materiality, that the asset needs to be located in proximity of a natural habitat. As mentioned in the example, this asset is indeed located in proximity of natural habitat, and it is once again in operation. Now, in this specific case, we look at a specific data type that can relate to the contribution to this SDG target. And in this case, we look at the net habitat gains in hectares. Now, in our case, the asset makes a negative contribution because the asset has a negative contribution by decreasing the net habitat gain in hectares. So thereby, we save a statement and have a potential of saving into our report. Now, in terms of the final output, we've now had 3 different statements. Here, all 3 statements are laid out in this example report. And in this example report, we've got reflected target 7.1, 10.3, and target 15.1, with each type of contribution statement that the onshore wind farm has made. So we have here the contribution that it makes in relation to the production and generation of energy. We have the potential and opportunity to make a contribution by having a policy and reporting on gender and diversity. And we have a negative contribution by decreasing net habitat gain in relation to SDG 15.1. With this type of report, the entity can now engage with its fund managers, asset managers, and asset operators and investors in relation to its contribution to the SDGs.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.